Imagine standing beneath a night sky thousands of years ago. No satellites, no city lights, just the stars, the moon, and the endless black above you. Then suddenly, the sky changes. The sun disappears in the middle of the day. A blood-red moon rises over the horizon, or a streak of fire cuts across the heavens for weeks. To ancient civilizations, these weren't just strange natural phenomena. They were signs. Messages from gods, warnings of disaster, or punishment for human sins. The heavens were the ultimate authority, and when they misbehaved, entire empires trembled. Today we're looking at forgotten astronomical events that absolutely terrified ancient civilizations. Real events that changed how people saw the world and the cosmos itself. On October 22nd, 2134, the sky darkened over ancient China, and two royal astronomers paid for it with their lives. Under the reign of Emperor Zhongkang, the Chinese court relied on astronomers to predict solar eclipses. But on that fateful day, the sun vanished unexpectedly in the middle of the day. The people panicked. Believing a celestial dragon was devouring the sun, they banged drums and shouted to scare it away. When daylight returned, the emperor demanded to know why his astronomers hadn't warned him. They were executed for negligence. To the ancient Chinese, the heavens reflected the emperor's power. A failed prediction wasn't just a mistake. It meant the emperor had lost harmony with the cosmos. What we now know as a solar eclipse became, in that moment, one of the most terrifying cosmic omens in early recorded history. In July 44 BC, a bright, fiery object appeared in the Roman sky and stayed there for 7 days. To the Romans, this wasn't just a comet. It was the soul of Julius Caesar rising to the heavens. The Great Comet of 44 BC was one of the brightest ever recorded, visible even in daylight. It appeared shortly after Caesar's assassination, and the timing was perfect for myth-making. The people believed it was a sign that Caesar had become a god. Temples were dedicated in his honor, and the comet became a political symbol used by his heir, Augustus. While the Romans found comfort in the idea, others across the world saw such comets as omens of destruction. To many ancient societies, comets were hairy stars that warned of plague, famine, or death. The same event that immortalized Caesar in the heavens terrified others who saw it as the universe tearing itself open. In the winter of 1841 CE, people across Europe and Asia looked up to see a long-tailed light stretching across the sky. It stayed visible for 2 months, terrifying everyone who saw it. In China, the emperor's advisors performed non-stop rituals to protect the empire. In Europe, chroniclers described it as, quote, a terrible sign, gleaming for many nights with grim brightness. The timing couldn't have been worse. The Carolingian Empire was collapsing in civil war, and famine was spreading. The comet of 841 to 842 CE became known as a star of doom. Its appearance seemed to mirror the chaos on Earth, convincing many that heaven itself had turned against them. Modern astronomers suspect it was a large, long-period comet, possibly with a tail spanning tens of millions of kilometers. To those watching from the ground, it was more than just light. It was a message that something terrible was coming, and they weren't wrong. In 797 AD, both Byzantine and Frankish chroniclers recorded something extraordinary. The sun, they said, went dark for over 2 weeks. The reports describe a pale, weak sun that barely illuminated the land. People across Europe and the Mediterranean began fasting, praying, and preparing for the end of days. Many connected the event to Emperor Constantine's blinding and overthrow, believing God himself had extinguished the light to signal disapproval. Modern scientists now think a major volcanic eruption may have thrown ash into the atmosphere, dimming the sun for weeks. But for the people at the time, it wasn't science, it was prophecy. To live in a world where daylight itself was fading was the ultimate horror. For 17 days, they believed they were living through the slow death of the world. In 1490 CE, the citizens of Qingyang, China looked up and saw the sky itself falling apart. Records from the Ming Dynasty describe stones falling like rain from the heavens. Thousands of people reportedly died as fiery rocks smashed into homes, streets, and fields. Some historians think this was caused by a meteor airburst, similar to the 1908 Tunguska explosion region in Siberia. The incident likely coincided with the appearance of a bright comet in 1490, which may have broken apart as it entered Earth's atmosphere. For the survivors, it was impossible to comprehend. The heavens had always been stable, perfect, divine, so when the sky began throwing rocks, it felt like judgment. Whether the death toll was in the hundreds or the thousands, the emotional impact was also enormous. For a moment, people truly believed the end had come.
In 1932, Australia declared war on emus, and the emus won. After World War I, the government gave land in Western Australia to returning soldiers so they could farm wheat. But then 20,000 emus migrated into the area after breeding season and started destroying everything, tearing up fences, eating crops, basically wiping out their livelihoods. The farmers asked the government for help, and since most of them were veterans, they didn't get scarecrows, they got soldiers. The military sent Major G.P.W. Meredith and his men, armed with 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The plan was to eliminate the emus in just a few days. Instead, it turned into an embarrassing disaster. The birds were too fast, too spread out, somehow way smarter than anyone expected. They moved in small groups, then zigzagged away from the onslaught, and even when cornered, the soldiers' firearms would often jam or they would miss. After weeks of chasing birds across the outback, they'd fired thousands of rounds and killed only a few hundred. The rest just ran off. Reporters started calling it the Great Emu War, and Major Meredith had to admit defeat, saying the emus had the quote invulnerability of tanks. One of the weirdest disasters in US history happened in Boston back in 1919. And it involved molasses. A massive storage tank in the North End neighborhood burst, unleashing over 2 million gallons of thick, sticky molasses into the streets. The wave was 25 feet high and moving about 35 miles an hour, fast enough to crush buildings, flip trucks, and knock a streetcar off its tracks. People described hearing this deep roar, like a freight train, before being swept up in the goo. It trapped everything: people, horses, cars. Some victims drowned because the syrup hardened in the cold air before rescuers could reach them. In total, 21 people were killed and around 150 were injured. Turns out the company responsible, Purity Distilling, hadn't even tested the tank properly. It leaked, often so badly that people would come to collect dripping molasses to use at home, and instead of fixing this, the company just painted the tank brown to hide the leaks. After it burst, the cleanup took weeks, and for decades afterward, people swore the area still smelled like molasses on particularly hot days. In 1814, a London brewery accidentally unleashed a flood of beer into the streets. It started at the Moen Company Brewery, where they made porter, a super popular dark beer at the time. Inside the brewery was this massive wooden vat, 22 feet tall, holding more than 300,000 gallons of beer. One afternoon, a metal band holding the vat slipped loose. Workers didn't panic. Apparently that happened all the time, but an hour later, the whole thing exploded. The pressure from all that beer was so strong, it blew down the brewery's back wall, and the wave of porter, about 15 feet high, tore through the streets. 2 houses were completely destroyed, and the beer flooded people's basements. 8 people were killed, including mourners at a funeral wake who got swept away by this tsunami of beer. Imagine being killed at a funeral. That'd be like getting married at someone else's wedding. In 1976, the Korean Demilitarized Zone became the site of a deadly incident over a tree trimming. 2 U.S. officers, Captain Boniface and First Lieutenant Barrett, were killed by North Korean soldiers while trying to trim a tree that was blocking the line of sight between checkpoints. 3 days later, the United States and South Korea responded with one of the most over-the-top displays of military power in history, but without any casualties. They launched Operation Paul Bunyan, named of course after the legendary lumberjack. Their mission was to remove that goddamn tree and show North Korea just how deadly they could be if they wanted to. The operation was massive. Engineers with chainsaws went to work while hundreds of soldiers surrounded them, fully armed. Overhead, there were 20 helicopters, B-52 bombers flew nearby, and fighter jets from multiple bases patrolled the area. Altogether, over 800 soldiers were involved in this. The North Koreans showed up with about 150 to 200 troops and just watched, clearly taken aback by the massive display of force. In the end, no shots were fired and no one was hurt except that damn tree. In 1962, a small village in Tanganyika, now Tanzania, experienced one of the weirdest outbreaks in history: uncontrollable laughter. It all started at a girls' boarding school. 3 students suddenly started breaking out into laughter, and they couldn't stop. Within days, the entire school was caught up. By the end of the first wave, 95 out of 159 girls were laughing nonstop. Some for hours, some for over 2 weeks. It got so bad the school had to close, and when it reopened, another group of students got hit, and eventually the epidemic spread to nearby villages too, shutting down 14 schools. This was manic, hysterical laughter. It was like Joker's laughing gas. People couldn't breathe properly, there was fainting. Some kids also started developing mysterious rashes. Doctors couldn't find a virus or anything contagious going on. They decided this was a case of stress-induced mass hysteria, or what scientists call mass psychogenic illness. Some people think it happened because Tanganyika had just become independent. Students were under a lot of pressure, home life was super strict, but at school they were being introduced to all these new ideas. Basically, the kids didn't know how to deal with all that stress, so they just laughed, and they couldn't stop. So in 1977, during a regular news broadcast in southern England, the audio suddenly cut out. The picture went all fuzzy, and there was this buzzing noise. Then a strange metallic voice cut in, claiming to be Vrillon from the Ashtar Galactic Command. And for nearly 6 minutes it delivered this bizarre message, warning humanity to stop fighting, destroy its weapons, and prepare for a great awakening. It also told viewers that they were being watched and guided by beings from other worlds. The station was completely unaware of what was going on until people started calling in. Engineers figured out someone had hijacked the signal by targeting a specific transmitter that rebroadcast signals from another tower, basically exploiting a weak point in the system. But even still, they never found out who actually did this. Whoever it was, though, needed some serious technical skill and equipment. People have analyzed every part of this message. Some say it was just a prank, others think it was someone who genuinely wanted to put this message out there, and then there are those who actually think this message was coming from somewhere up in space. I'd love to believe that, but I don't. Back in March of 2015, Coco 5 News in Oklahoma City was running a normal early morning traffic report. Nothing exciting, just the usual aerial feed from their Grand Casino Skycam out in Shawnee. But then, out of nowhere, this glowing white object zipped across the screen at lightning speed. It was super fast, too fast to be a plane, and the movement doesn't look like a drone either. The news anchors didn't even notice it live. Viewers caught it first and started flooding the station with questions. To their credit, the news station didn't ignore it. They re-aired the footage and posted it online, asking the public to help figure out what it was. Problem is, nobody really could. It wasn't a meteor, those fall, they don't fly sideways at a steady height. It wasn't a bug on the lens either, the light shifts as it moves and you could see it behind distant clouds. It wasn't a military or commercial aircraft as far as anyone could tell, and it didn't match any scheduled flights. Despite being caught live on air and analyzed frame by frame, nobody's ever nailed down exactly what this thing was. Alright, this is an interesting one, because it's not what happened on TV that was the mysterious part, but what was going on with viewers while the broadcast was happening. So in 1992, the BBC aired a Halloween special called Ghost Watch. This was a fake documentary about a haunted house in North London. The thing is, most viewers didn't realize it was scripted. The show was presented like any other live broadcast, except the crew was investigating a poltergeist called Pipes. Viewers at home would catch glimpses of the ghostly figure of Pipes in the background of shots, and there would be weird audio glitches. On top of that, of course, the subject matter was just unsettling on its own. The atmosphere felt real. Too real. And as the broadcast went on, people started calling in to report their own paranormal experiences. Others were convinced that the show had invited an actual spirit into their homes. The BBC got tens of thousands of complaints. One girl reportedly entered a catatonic state after watching it. People were legitimately freaking out. Even though the show had a brief disclaimer at the start, If you happened to tune in after it, you'd have no way of knowing that this was staged. The format fooled a lot of people, including some of the presenters who weren't even told everything that would happen. Scientists and psychologists later studied the public's reaction to the show, calling it a rare case of mass suggestion triggered by media. The show only aired once and the BBC banned it for a decade. In November of 2024, a local New York TV station was doing live helicopter coverage of traffic over the Hudson River. Same old stuff, until this strange glowing orb floats into the frame, hovering, changing color, then darting out of view. It starts out white and then turns blue and kind of semi-translucent before flying off. The anchor didn't react at the moment, but when the clip was shared online, people started talking about it. Some blamed lens flares, some guessed maybe it was a drone, others said a weather balloon, but the object didn't behave like any of those. It hovered, it changed color, then accelerated. Not even the FAA had an answer.
On a cold night in November 1577, people across Europe saw a new, terrifying light dominate the sky. It was enormous, its tail stretched halfway across the heavens, and it stayed visible for weeks. Known today as the Great Comet of 1577, it terrified both peasants and kings. The Turkish Sultan Murad III believed it warned of disaster for his empire. In England, commoners whispered that it foretold death and plague. Even astronomers were shaken. The comet's brightness and position helped Tycho Brahe realize that comets weren't atmospheric, but truly celestial, beyond the moon. But to everyone else, it was a sign that the world had gone wrong. Wars raged, famine spread, and disease followed in its wake. To the people of the 16th century, this wasn't just science. It was apocalypse made visible. Imagine being a Maya priest watching the moon turn blood red. To us, a lunar eclipse is beautiful. To the ancient Maya, it meant the gods of the underworld were attacking the moon. In their mythology, the moon goddess represented fertility and life. When she was darkened or turned crimson, it was seen as a battle between light and death. During an eclipse, Maya priests would perform sacrifices and rituals to save the moon, hoping to restore balance. Archaeological and codex evidence shows that they could even predict lunar eclipses with remarkable accuracy, but that didn't make them less terrifying. Even knowing when one was coming didn't change the emotion of it. The moment the moon began to vanish, every drumbeat and cry from the temples echoed with the same fear. What if this time the gods don't give it back? High in the Andes, the Inca Empire built its power on the rhythm of the sun. Every year during the winter solstice, they held the Festival of the Sun to honor their god. The sun's path was sacred. It dictated farming, religion, and the authority of the emperor himself, who was believed to be a direct descendant of the sun. So, when the solstice behaved strangely, when storms or unexpected alignments blocked the sunrise, it was a moment of national panic. Priests would fast and perform rituals, sometimes sacrificing animals or humans to help the sun return to its proper path. In some years, strange weather patterns or volcanic haze made the sunrise dim and late, convincing the people that the sun had grown weak or angry. For the Incas, this wasn't symbolic, it was survival. Without the sun's favor, crops failed and empires fell. In the late 1520s, the Inca Empire was divided in civil war between two brothers, Atahualpa and Huascar. Then, during one of their battles, a total solar eclipse plunged the sky into darkness. Both armies froze in fear. To them, the sun was their protector, and its disappearance meant divine punishment. Chroniclers later recorded that Atahualpa's side took it as a sign that he had been chosen by the gods. Huascar's followers panicked, convinced that the heavens had cursed them. Shortly after, Huascar was captured and executed. When the Spanish arrived just years later, the empire was fractured and vulnerable. A single eclipse didn't cause the empire's fall, but it became part of the legend. To the Inca people, it was the moment the gods turned away, letting foreigners take what was once theirs. In the spring of 1066, a blazing comet appeared in the night sky. It shone so brightly that it was visible even during the day, and its tail stretched like a sword above England. This was Halley's Comet, and it arrived at the worst possible moment. King Harold II had just seized the English throne. People across the land believed the comet meant one thing: doom. Within months, William of Normandy invaded England. The Bayeux Tapestry, which still survives today, shows the comet above King Harold with the caption, "A sign from the heavens." After the Battle of Hastings, Harold was dead and William was king. Whether coincidence or cosmic timing, the event cemented Halley's Comet as one of history's most famous omens. Even centuries later, kings and peasants alike would look to the sky in terror whenever it returned.
On May 24th, 2024, Peng Yuzhang was testing some new paragliding gear when a freak updraft called a cloud suck pulled him straight up into the sky. He ended up 27,800 feet above the Earth, basically cruising at the altitude of commercial airliners. He had a camera on his glider, so the whole terrifying experience was caught on film. In the video, he's flying through a cloud, his face and body coated in ice. He said he couldn't see where he was going. "Without the compass, I wouldn't have known which way I was going. I thought I was flying straight, but in reality, I was spinning," he said. He tried to descend, but the updraft just kept pulling him higher. "I wanted to come down quickly, but I just couldn't. I was lifted higher and higher until I was inside the cloud," he continued. At that height, the temperature can drop to minus 40 degrees, and Yuzhang thinks he may have lost consciousness at some point from the lack of oxygen. His accidental ascent nearly broke the world record for highest paragliding flight, a record set in 2007 by German paraglider Eva Wernerska, who was sucked into a thunderstorm and ended up 6 miles above Earth for about 45 minutes. In March 2025, Myanmar was hit by a 7.7 magnitude earthquake, and for the first time ever, a rupture in the Earth's crust was caught on camera. The footage comes from a surveillance camera in Mandalay, the country's second largest city. At first, you could just see a property gate trembling as the quake starts, cracks forming in the concrete. But then on the right-hand side of the frame, the driveway literally slides along the ground. Scientists say this is the first time fault line motion has been recorded like this. California-based earthquake geologist Wendy Bowen told the media, "My jaw hit the floor. We have laboratory models of it, but all of those are far less complex than the actual natural system. So to see it actually happening was mind-blowing." Judith Hubbard, an assistant professor at Cornell, said she keeps rewatching it. "It's really kind of staggering to see a fault slide in real time, especially for someone like me who has spent years studying these things, but always from more remote kinds of data, like offsets after the fact or data recorded by sensors," end quote. The earthquake caused massive damage, even as far away as Bangkok, and tragically, around 3,700 people died. On July 3rd, NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers captured an incredible image of a giant lightning sprite stretching above a thunderstorm over Mexico and the southern US. She snapped the image from the International Space Station. This isn't an artistic rendering or anything. Just wow. "As we went over Mexico and the US this morning, I caught this sprite," Ayers wrote on X. She went on to say that sprites are, quote, TLEs, or transient luminous events, that happen above the clouds and are triggered by intense electrical activity and the thunderstorms below. We have a great view of the clouds, so scientists can use these types of pictures to better understand the formation, characteristics, and relationship of TLEs to thunderstorms," end quote. Sprites were first spotted by airline passengers back in the 50s, but they weren't photographed until 1989. And researchers still aren't sure why some storms produce them, while others don't, but seeing them from space like this, though, visually stunning. This is footage of an exploding ant. Yes, this is a real thing. Exploding ants are a group of ants with a very dramatic defense mechanism. Their colonies typically live in trees, and how these things get their name is for their ability to sacrifice themselves for the greater good of the colony when threatened by predators. Kamikaze ants would also be a great name for these things, a nickname anyway. The worker ants of these species have large specialized glands that are full of all these toxic substances, and when the colony is under attack, some worker ants will rupture their own bodies, releasing this sticky, toxic stuff that takes out the intruder. It also kills the ant itself. The toxic substance released by these exploding ants is a cocktail of chemicals. It doesn't just trap and scare off predators, it also warns other colony members that there's danger afoot. The sacrifice of a few individuals helps to ensure the survival of the entire colony. Logic clearly dictates that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. little Star Trek reference for you. I think Spock would like these ants. Back in 1974, a woman named Doris Bither reached out to parapsychologist Barry Taff at UCLA, saying she and her kids were experiencing some seriously strange stuff in their Culver City home. The house was in bad shape, condemned, and Bither was living there illegally with her 4 children. On top of that, Bither had a rough history. She'd struggled with violent partners and substance problems and had a pretty traumatic childhood. But she claimed that invisible entities had attacked her. Taff and his colleague Carrie Gaynor visited the house multiple times over 10 weeks, starting on August 22nd, 1974. They reported what they called poltergeist activity, objects falling off shelves on their own cold spots, bad odors, strange lights. The intensity of these events seemed to fade over time, though. They were also sometimes joined by a friend of Bither's who said she could talk to spirits, plus various people connected to the UCLA lab, but only Taff, Gaynor, and Bither described anything unusual themselves. And they took photos with a Polaroid and a 35mm camera that had become pretty well known in paranormal circles. Taff believed there was a genuine haunting going on here, and these images were just the tip of the iceberg. What you're seeing here is news coverage in Laos of a mysterious phenomenon known as the Naga fireballs. Every year in late October, crowds gather along the Mekong River in Thailand to watch red balls of light float up from the water and then vanish into the night sky. They're called Naga fireballs, and locals say they're caused by a giant serpent spirit that lives in the river. The orbs don't make any noise, they come out of nowhere and they rise fast, sometimes hundreds in one night. There's been a lot of debate about what's really going on here. A Thai documentary once claimed it was just tracer rounds being fired by soldiers across the river in Laos. Others have blamed flare guns or some kind of flammable gas bubbling up from the riverbed, like methane or phosphine, but none of those explanations totally hold up. The balls don't behave like flares, and scientists pointed out that the conditions needed for gas bubbles to ignite like that don't really line up. In 2021, during a strict curfew, officials made sure there were no people out with flares, and the fireballs still showed up. This footage was taken in downtown Milwaukee in 2018 during a live broadcast. The news anchors had no idea what they were looking at. Fireworks? Aliens? They joked. It's very strange. This doesn't even look like your typical UAP footage. These things aren't moving in any sort of recognizable pattern. They're just floating in every which direction. They almost look like ghosts zipping through the air than any artificial object. And there are so many of them. It's really cool, but if I saw this in person, I'd be pretty unsettled. What do you all think of this one? If someone can enlighten me as to what this could be, please share your thoughts down below. This next one comes from a 2017 episode of the British talk show This Morning, featuring a couple and their possessed doll. The chair it sat on started to rock on its own several times throughout the interview.
That chair is beginning to rock.
Rocking.
Look at that.
Who's doing that? Stop it.
The owner said that she and her husband had been walking by an antique store when they spotted a few old-looking dolls. The couple decided to buy a few of them because they were cheap and figured they might be able to flip them for more. Well, as soon as the dolls came home with them, strange things started to happen. They had one doll, the one they brought to the TV studio, sitting on the dresser in their room. Well, one morning the husband got up, hopped in the shower, and then suddenly felt this burning sensation on his leg.
And I looked down and there was a lot of scratches all over my knee.
They put the doll in their shed inside a plastic bin. Well, a couple days later, the wife went in and opened the bin, only to find that somehow the doll's necklace had been removed, even though it had been wrapped up tightly on the doll initially. And that night she woke up at 2 a.m. hearing this whooshing noise moving past the bed, almost like the rustling of clothing, or more specifically, a dress. There was nothing there. They ended up selling the doll. Did Pope Francis vanish into thin air on live TV? This was filmed back in April of 2020. The Pope showed up at the window above St. Peter's Square to bless people affected by the pandemic. Then he turned around and walked back inside, only before he was out of camera range, he suddenly just vanishes. You don't see him slowly disappear into the shadows. He's just there 1 second, then he's not. It's pretty bizarre. It's hard to find the original news segment online too, because it was taken down for some reason. In 2010, a Jamaican news station covered a story about a boy who claimed that he was being haunted by a duppy, basically a ghost. And the news team captured two strange incidents on camera. First, the boy is sitting in a chair talking about the strange experiences when all of a sudden he flies backward, as if something is pulling him. Then later in the segment, the boy claims to see the spirit standing close by watching him, and then he gets pulled again. At least that's what it looks like. Now, notice how one of his legs is in the air as he continues to move backward. And then when his mom grabs him, his legs flip around like they're being grabbed at by someone, only we can't actually see anyone. It could be faked, but it is a damn good performance by this kid if it is. Alright, so at first glance, this just looks like some streaker running around a soccer field. If you're watching casually, you might even laugh it off, but the longer you watch, the weirder this footage is. This figure shows up from multiple camera angles, dashing through the crowd and along the edge of the field, and nobody reacts, at all. No one turns their head, no one flinches, it's like they don't even see it. Then you notice this thing doesn't look fully solid, it's kind of see-through. There's a moment where it looks like it passes right through a group of people. Plus, this person actually ends up on the field, and if you know anything about stadium security, you know the second someone who's not meant to be there steps foot on the grass, they're getting tackled and dragged off. But here, nothing happens.
Number 10. Violet Jessup survived 3 sinking ships. Violet Jessup had some horrible luck, or great luck, however you want to look at it. In 1911, she began working as a stewardess on the White Star Line RMS Olympic. Violet was on board September 20th, 1911 when Olympic left from Southampton and collided with the British warship HMS Hawke. Despite damage, the ship was able to make it back to port without sinking. She continued to work on Olympic until April 1912 when she was transferred to its sister ship, the Titanic. Violet boarded the RMS Titanic as a stewardess on April 10th, 1912. 4 days later, on April 14th, it struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sank about 2 hours and 40 minutes after the collision. She was later ordered into Lifeboat 16, and as the boat was being lowered, one of Titanic's officers gave her a baby to look after. The next morning, Violet and the rest of the survivors were rescued by the RMS Carpathia and taken to New York City on April 18th. Then, in the First World War, Violet was a stewardess for the British Red Cross. On the morning of November 21st, 1916, she was aboard the HMHS Britannic, the younger sister ship of Olympic and Titanic that had been converted into a hospital ship when it sank in the Aegean Sea after an unexplained explosion. Britannic sank within 55 minutes, ending the lives of 30 of the 1,066 people on board. Now, it's just incredible that she survived all 3 incidents without getting injured, and I can't believe that after that first sinking, she would go on a boat again, because I know I wouldn't. Number 9. Carbon dioxide went down due to so many deaths. Genghis Khan was the founder and first Khagan of the Mongol Empire, which later became the largest adjoining land empire in history. Having spent the majority of his life uniting the Mongol tribes, he launched a series of military campaigns which conquered large parts of China and Central Asia. In the 13th century, he ended the lives of so many peasants that the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were significantly reduced as a result. During his 21-year reign, his destructive armies were responsible for the deaths of up to 40 million people. With so many people gone and nobody left to farm the lands owned by the peasants, nature went back to its true form and grew back into carbon-absorbing forests. It's estimated that 700 million tons of carbon were wiped from the atmosphere, which, to put in perspective, is around the same amount of carbon dioxide generated in a year through global gasoline consumption. That is just crazy. Number 8. The unlucky town of St. Pierre. In the late 1890s and early 1900s, St. Pierre, Martinique was known as a beautiful town, but there was a darkness looming over it, a volcano. Citizens of the area were so used to the volcanic activity that no one took it seriously when the fresh steaming vent holes and earth tremors started during April 1902. The minor explosions began at the summit of the volcano, ash began to rain down continuously, and the nauseating stench of sulfur filled the air, but for some reason they stayed in the town. Even worse, more than 100 snakes slithered down and invaded the town. Yeah, snakes. And they ended the lives of 50 people, and people still stayed living there. Then on May 5th, a landslide of boiling mud and water from the Itang Sek crater spilled into the River Blanche and 23 workmen died. This was followed by a tsunami that ended the lives of hundreds of people. Now this naturally caused concern in the town and many people wanted to leave. So yeah, people just stayed there and went on with their lives while all of this was happening. Even after the whole snake situation, it couldn't be me. Now 3 days later on May 8th, Mount Pelee finally exploded, sending an avalanche of white hot lava straight towards the town. Within 3 minutes, St. Pierre was completely obliterated of its 30,000 population, and there were only 2 people who survived. Number 7. The Great Stink. Yes, this is a real thing. The Great Stink was an event in central London during July and August of 1858 in which the hot weather exacerbated the smell of untreated human waste and industrial effluent that was present on the banks of the River Thames. The problem had been mounting for some years with aging and inadequate sewer systems that emptied directly into the Thames. The ensuing melee, which was further aggravated by pointless rumors, made people believe that the bad odor was capable of causing communicable diseases such as cholera. The smell, combined with possible side effects, prompted authorities to seek help of a civil engineer, Joseph Bazalgette. His proposal ensured that the sewage was no longer dumped on the shores of the Thames. Joseph's work ensured that sewage was no longer dumped onto the shores of the Thames and brought an end to the cholera outbreaks. His actions are thought to have saved more lives than the efforts of any other Victorian official. And his sewer system operates into the 21st century, servicing a city that has grown to the population of over 8 million. Number 6. World War I Christmas Truce. During Christmas of 1914, a truce was held between Germany and the UK. They decorated their shelters, exchanged gifts across no man's land, and played a game of football between the soldiers. The event, dubbed as the Christmas Truce, was considered to be a series of unofficial ceasefires during World War I in 1914. The event was celebrated as a peace offering on the Western Front. The idea for the temporary hiatus was put forth by Pope Benedict XV on December 7th, 1914. Both Germany and the United Kingdom refused to declare an official ceasefire. However, soldiers from both sides declared a temporary ceasefire on their own. They gathered together and celebrated the season of joy by singing carols. They also exchanged gifts that included cigarettes and plum puddings, and a good gesture, soldiers from both sides played a friendly game of soccer. Now this is so sweet and cute to me, like, aw.
Ever seen lightning strike an erupting volcano? Well, here it is. Last year in Guatemala, people watching the eruption of Volcan de Fuego got a rare sight. Lightning bolts flashing straight out of the erupting volcano. Volcanic lightning is a real thing. When a volcano erupts, it shoots ash, gas, and rock into the air. Those ash particles collide with each other, and every collision builds up static electricity. The Center for the Study of Active Volcanoes at the University of Hawaii at Hilo explains that as the ash rubs together, atoms shed or pick up electrons, creating zones with positive and negative charges. When the imbalance gets strong enough, those electrons jump through the air to even things out. That jump is what we see as lightning. Scientists even have a name for it: a dirty thunderstorm. I like that. In 2015, something strange started happening off the coast of Alaska near the Kodiak archipelago. People began finding dead whales. A lot of them. By the time researchers got there, they'd counted around 30 carcasses. Most of them fin whales, all stranded or floating nearby. What really threw scientists off was that they all seemed to have died around the same time. First, they suspected a toxic algae bloom, which can sometimes poison marine life, but that theory didn't really hold up. No other species were dying off like this, and the ocean conditions didn't match that. A few months earlier, huge numbers of seabirds had mysteriously died in the same area, though, so researchers figured there could be a connection there, but they never found a clear answer. Some scientists think there were probably even more whales that died but drifted away or were eaten before anyone could find them. This video you're seeing here was not created with AI. In 2023, a video from Fallbrook Houston News started making the rounds, showing this massive sinkhole tearing open a road. At first, there's already a big hole, and then you watch it just keep getting bigger and bigger as the ground gives way. The concrete cracks, the asphalt folds in, chunks of the road just fall out. What makes it even crazier is people are just standing a few feet away filming the whole thing. You can see the edges shifting where they're standing and nobody's moving. Like, water's rushing underneath, washing away the dirt, and the hole keeps widening while everyone just stays there watching. I mean, some people are kind of moving away, but not fast enough. I mean, if I saw this, I'd think Satan was about to pop out of the ground. I would not be standing around like that. This video is not AI either. I gotta say that. But these days, when I see anything even mildly extraordinary online, I gotta take a moment to figure that out. But anyway, no, this was filmed by a guy named Ronald Drago. Looks like a sea serpent, but it's actually a massive sturgeon. I mean, it's basically a sea serpent though. Look at the size of this thing. Sturgeons have been around since the Jurassic period as well, and they haven't changed much since then. Some of them can reach lengths of over 20 feet and weigh more than 1,000 pounds, which puts them in the same size range as a great white shark. They're bottom feeders, mostly eating small fish and crustaceans, and they're not dangerous on purpose, but because of their size, they can be. There have been real cases of sturgeons leaping out of the water and hitting people on boats. Let's talk about another creature, smaller, but possibly stranger, the hairy frog found in Central African forests. I had no idea these things existed, and they had to be the creepiest frog species I've ever heard of. I mean, look at this thing. Hairy frogs, also known as horror frogs or wolverine frogs, are really cool, not your typical cute kind of frog. These things have a very bizarre defense mechanism, for a frog anyway, but I'll get to that in a minute. So these frogs get their name because they have what looks like hair on the sides of their bodies and thighs. It isn't actually hair though, it just has the appearance of it. It's actually called dermal papillae, which contains blood vessels. So the hair-looking stuff is thought to help them breathe better. So how do they get the Wolverine nickname? Well, this is pretty cool. So these frogs have the ability to break their own bones. So when they're threatened, they can force the bones in their toes through the skin, essentially creating claws like Wolverine. Pretty wild.
On the island of Öland in Sweden sits the ruins of Sandbyborg, an Iron Age ring fort. For centuries, locals avoided the site, whispering that it was cursed. Archaeologists now know why. Around the late 5th century, the fort's entire population was slaughtered. Excavations revealed families killed inside their homes, skeletons lying where they fell. Nothing was looted. Weapons, jewelry, even livestock were left untouched, as if attackers wanted the place to remain frozen in time. For more than 1,000 years, no one resettled the fort. It became a literal ghost village, avoided by locals who sensed something unnatural had happened here. To this day, we don't know who carried out the massacre or why. All that remains is an eerie silence, as though the land itself remembers the horror. The early 20th century brought one of the coldest rivalries in history. Who would be the first to reach the South Pole? Two men led the charge, Norwegian Roald Amundsen and British explorer Robert Falcon Scott. Amundsen's team used dog sleds, moved quickly, and planted the Norwegian flag at the pole in December 1911. Scott, however, took a slower route with ponies and motor sledges. By the time his team arrived in January 1912, they were devastated to find the flag already there. The return journey was a nightmare. Facing frostbite, starvation, and blizzards, Scott and his companions all perished in their tent, just 11 miles from a supply depot. When their frozen bodies were discovered months later, Scott's diary told the grim tale of their slow decline. The South Pole race became not just an adventure story, but a real tragedy that reads like the climax of a survival horror novel. In 1897, Swedish engineer Salomon August André had a bold idea. Why not drift across the Arctic Ocean in a giant hydrogen balloon? He believed it would be faster than sleds and safer than ships. Spoiler alert, it was not. André and his two companions launched from Svalbard, Norway. Almost immediately, the balloon began leaking gas and crashing into the icy wasteland. For weeks, the three men stumbled across the Arctic, leaving behind eerie journals describing frostbite, exhaustion, and desperation. They eventually disappeared. Their remains weren't discovered until 1930, more than 3 decades later, perfectly preserved along with their photographs and diaries. The recovered records read like a horror story written in real time, the optimism of a bold plan unraveling into tragedy under the endless polar night. Not all horror stories are disasters. Some are deliberate. In the mid-18th century, the Qianlong Emperor of the Qing dynasty in China gave a chilling order. the complete extermination of the Zungar people. The Zungar, a Mongol ethnic group living in what is now Xinjiang, had resisted Qing rule throughout repeated uprisings. Finally, the emperor declared that the Zungar had proven themselves too troublesome to be allowed to live. He commanded his generals not to accept any surrender, claiming that any plea for mercy was just a trick. What followed was a campaign of extermination that wiped out much of the Zungar population through killings, famine, and disease. Modern historians describe it as one of the clearest cases of genocide in early modern history. Entire communities were erased from the map, leaving a silence that still lingers in Central Asia today. Picture this. It's the 1920s and no one has ever stood on the roof of the world. Before oxygen tanks, high-tech gear, or GPS mapping, the first climbers to attempt Mount Everest faced a mountain that might as well have been another planet. In 1924, George Mallory and Andrew Irving made their infamous attempt. They were last spotted climbing high on the northeast ridge, less than 1,000 feet from the summit, before clouds swallowed them whole. They never came back down. Their disappearance haunted explorers for decades. Mallory's body wasn't discovered until 1999, perfectly preserved by the ice, still wearing his climbing gear. No one knows if they reached the top before they died, but the mountain kept their secret. Imagine vanishing into the world's deadliest peak only to reappear 75 years later, as if time had frozen. It's history with the chill of a ghost story.
Number 5. A baboon was employed. Jack, a Chekma baboon, worked as a railway signal changer in South Africa for 9 years. Yup, you heard that right. He was initially employed as a pet assistant to a disabled railway signalman named James Wide. James, who was a double-leg amputee, purchased Jack and trained him to push his wheelchair and operate rail signals under his supervision. The idea of a baboon manning the signals caused an investigation to be initiated, and the authorities, though skeptical, after witnessing his job competency, officially employed Jack. The celebrity employee was paid 20 cents a day and half a bottle of beer every week. Throughout the 9 years of his employment, Jack never committed a single mistake. Now, I don't know if this is amazing or exploiting an animal, but it's absolutely insane. Number 4. The Dancing Plague. The Dancing Plague was a case of dancing mania that occurred in modern-day France in the Holy Roman Empire from July 1518 to September 1518. Somewhere between 50 and 400 people took dancing for weeks. The outbreak began in July 1518 when a woman by the name of Defy began dancing fervently in the street in Strasbourg. She kept up this constant dancing for a week straight. Soon, 36 others joined in on the dancing chaos. In August of that same year, the Dancing Plague had claimed 400 victims. Dancers were beginning to collapse, and it is said some even died due to stroke or heart attacks. No one knew what was causing this reaction, which meant no one understood how to remedy the situation either. Now, by early September, the outbreak began to subside as the dancers were sent to a mountain shrine to pray for absolution. Now, there are many theories behind the phenomenon, the most popular being stress-induced mass hysteria, suggested by John Waller. Other theories include ergo and religious explanations. Number 3. The doctor with a 300% mortality rate. Robert Liston, a surgeon in the 1800s, performed an operation with a 300% mortality rate. Instead of saving the patient, he ended the lives of 3 people. He was renowned for being one of the fastest surgeons alive, which at that time was a very good thing. Anesthesia as we know it didn't exist, so patients were awake for the entire procedure, meaning the shorter it was, the better. Robert was performing a leg amputation, but worked so fast that he accidentally cut off fingers on his assistant's hand. Both the patient and the assistant died later of gangrene, most likely due to the saw being unclean. And what about the third death? Well, doctors and other spectators would often watch these surgeries from the gallery, which was much more up close and personal than medical galleries today. During the procedure, Robert accidentally swiped an elderly doctor with a blade, slicing the fabric of the doctor's suit coat. Thinking he had been cut open, the doctor went into shock and died of a subsequent violent heart attack. Thus, 3 people died during an operation that was meant to save 1 life. Number 2. Clogged toilet sinks submarine. During World War II, the German submarine U-1206 joined the war in early April 1945. Commander Karl Adolf Schlitt proudly captained the crew into battle. However, they forgot one crucial weapon in their war with the Allied forces: a plunger. At the time, the British submarines would store the excrement on the boat and dump it once they returned to land. German submarines were far more advanced and had a complicated toilet system that would shoot waste into the sea. But after being at sea for a few weeks, the submarine's toilet system malfunctioned, leading to a smelly problem. The situation soon became dire as seawater and sewage poured into the sub and began mixing with the ship's battery. With no choices left, Schlitt ordered the submarine to resurface immediately. Unfortunately, they resurfaced near Scotland and caught the attention of the nearby British Royal Navy. Within moments, they were attacked and died. Now, this is actually kind of funny because what do you mean that happened with the toilet? And coming in at number 1 is the disappearance of Prime Minister Harold Holt. On December 17, 1967, Harold Holt, the Prime Minister of Australia, disappeared while swimming in the sea near Porsta, Victoria. Harold knew the area well and had swum there many times before. He did not hesitate in entering the water despite a large swell and visible currents. He swam with one other person as the others he was with considered it unsafe, and he swam into deeper waters and was dragged out into sea. The others called out to him, but he did not raise his arms or cry for help. He soon slipped under the waves and out of sight. The Victoria Police were contacted and initiated what became one of the largest search operations in Australian history. The entire Australian Defence Force was put on high alert. An enormous search operation was mounted and around the beach with helicopters, watercraft, police divers, 2 naval diving teams, and more than 340 people were involved in the search. Strangely, his body was never recovered. He was presumed to have died, and his memorial service was 5 days later, attended by many world leaders. Now, it's generally agreed that the disappearance was a simple case of an accidental drowning, but a number of conspiracy theories surfaced. In 1968, a story in the Sunday Observer claimed that Harold had been assassinated by the US Central Intelligence Agency, supposedly because he intended to pull Australia out of Vietnam. Also, suggestions were made that Harold had his life ended by the North Vietnamese after being incapacitated by a nerve agent, of course, or that he had faked his own death to be with a lover. In 1983, British journalist Anthony Gray published The Prime Minister Was a Spy, in which he claimed that Harold was a long-life spy for the People's Republic of China. According to Anthony, Harold faked his own death to defect to China and was collected by frogmen who dragged him to a waiting submarine. So what happened, I guess we'll never know, but it seems he just went poof.
On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 took off, heading to Beijing with 239 people on board. And then, during what should have been a routine part of the flight, it went off course. Communications stopped, the route changed, and after that, the world got a mystery so big it basically swallowed the sky. Here's what makes MH370 so haunting. Investigators have radar data that suggests the plane turned back, and satellite handshakes that indicated it likely kept flying for hours after it disappeared from normal tracking. That points to a long, silent journey ending somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean. But despite an enormous search, the main wreckage has never been publicly confirmed and recovered. Some debris linked to the aircraft has washed up on the shorelines far from the flight path, which proves the plane came apart somewhere. The problem is the ocean is huge, deep, and cruelly good at hiding things. Picture astronomers spotting an object from deep space, realizing it is not from our solar system, and then watching it do something that makes them go, wait a second. In October 2017, scientists detected Oumuamua, the first confirmed interstellar object ever observed passing through our solar system. That alone is wild. A visitor from another star system just cruising through our neighborhood. But then it got weird. As it traveled away from the sun, its path showed a small extra acceleration, like something was gently pushing it. That can happen if an object is outgassing, like a comet, basically venting material that acts like tiny rocket thrust, but telescopes did not see the usual comet stuff. No clear dust cloud, no obvious tail. On top of that, Oumuamua appeared unusually elongated, and it was tumbling in a way that looked chaotic, not like a neat spinning top. Scientists proposed different explanations, including unusual outgassing that is hard to detect, or surface effects, or something stranger. And we only had a short time to study it before it was gone back into the dark. Here's a sentence that still feels fake to say out loud. The US Department of Defense released official Navy videos of strange aerial objects and openly called them unidentified. The videos most people know as Flyer 1, Gimbal, and Go Fast were recorded by Navy systems during training operations, including off the US East Coast in 2014 and 2015. These clips circulated publicly for years, and then in April 2020, the Department of Defense formally released them, basically saying, yes, these are real Navy videos, and we are releasing them to reduce confusion about what is out there. That does not mean aliens. It does mean unidentified. The object in the footage was not confirmed as any specific aircraft, drone, balloon, or known system in the public explanation. So, that's like a little creepy, I guess, really, when you think about it. Could be cool, could be horrible. Okay, emergency alert. Okay, sorry about that, I'm back. Surprise. Emergency alert. There was earthquake tremors. I just ignored it. I ignored it so hard and then the ground started moving. First time that's ever happened to me. 29 years old. That was weird. That was weird. Imagine you're in your home overseas and you suddenly feel intense pressure, dizziness, and disorienting symptoms that stick around. Then you find out it happened to other people too, in other places. Starting around late 2016, US and Canadian officials reported clusters of strange health symptoms in various locations, first widely associated with Havana, Cuba, and later reported in multiple countries. The public nickname became Havana syndrome, though governments often call them anomalous health incidents. Here is what makes this so complicated. The symptoms reported are real experiences for the people involved, and multiple investigations have looked at them. But the case is heavily disputed. Some journalists and outside investigators have suggested possible hostile action. Other official assessments have said it is very unlikely that a foreign adversary or some kind of directed energy device is responsible, at least for most cases. If you saw this with your own eyes, you would not think weather. You would think the sky is glitching. On December 9th, 2009, people across Norway and parts of Sweden saw a massive spiral of light expanding in the sky. It looked like a glowing blue beam with a swirling geometric spiral blooming out of it. And it lasted long enough for tons of people to photograph it. At first, nobody publicly owned it. Then the explanation emerged that it was linked to a failed Russian missile test. The idea is that a malfunction caused the missile to spin, and the exhaust created that surreal spiral pattern at high altitude where it could spread out and reflect sunlight in a dramatic way. The French Revolution promised liberty, equality, and fraternity, but it also delivered one of the most terrifying chapters in European history. Between 1793 and 1794, during the Reign of Terror, France's revolutionary leaders turned the guillotine into a symbol of both justice and fear. Tens of thousands were executed for alleged disloyalty, including nobles, priests, and even ordinary citizens accused by neighbors. In some regions, people weren't just beheaded, they were drowned in mass in rivers like the Loire. The entire country lived in paranoia, knowing a careless word could end with a march to the scaffold. The Sanson family, executioners of Paris for generations, later published memoirs describing their work. Reading them today feels like flipping through the journals of a grim reaper. The Enlightenment had promised progress, but for those living in revolutionary France, it was survival in a world that had turned into a real-life horror show. In the 20th century, Romania's dictator Nicolae Ceausescu created a reign of terror that felt ripped from a dystopian novel. He built a personality cult so extreme that his face appeared on everything, from coins to textbooks, while his people suffered under shortages of food, medicine, and even electricity. By 1989, the Romanian people had had enough. Protests erupted and Ceausescu tried to rally the crowds with one last speech, but instead of cheering, they booed him on live television, a sound he had never heard before. Within days, Ceausescu and his wife Elena were captured. On Christmas Day, they were put on trial by a hastily formed tribunal, accused of crimes against the people, and executed by firing squad. The fall of his regime was sudden, shocking, and chaotic, like the abrupt end of a dictator's horror story playing out on the world stage. Imagine being in Rome at the height of its power, only to watch it crumble under a sickness no one understood. Between 165 and 180 CE, the Antonine Plague swept through the empire, killing millions. Contemporary accounts describe victims with fevers, black sores, and unbearable thirst. Whole towns were depopulated. Soldiers died by the thousands, crippling Rome's legions. Even Emperor Marcus Aurelius couldn't escape its grip, recording in his writings how the empire itself seemed poisoned. Historians debate whether it was smallpox or measles, but either way, the Antonine Plague left Rome reeling. Streets filled with uncollected corpses, funeral pyres smoked day and night, and panic spread across the empire. It was an ancient pandemic that felt like the wrath of the gods, and it nearly broke the world's greatest superpower of the time. Over 4,000 years, the Akkadian Empire ruled Mesopotamia. Then, almost as quickly as it had risen, it fell apart in what can only be described as one of the earliest apocalyptic collapses. According to a surviving Sumerian text, King Naram-Sin angered the gods by defiling a temple. The punishment was catastrophic: droughts, crop failures, invasions, and plague. Archaeology backs this up. Around 2200 BCE, records show trade routes collapsed, cities were abandoned, and skeletal remains revealed famine-stricken populations. To the people of the time, it must have felt like the end of the world. Their empire didn't just fall, it evaporated, leaving behind only broken walls, scattered bones, and a chilling story etched in clay tablets that reads like a curse. You don't usually think of beer as deadly, but in London in 1814 it became a killer. At the Mew and Company Brewing, a massive vat holding over 300,000 gallons of beer suddenly ruptured. The wave that followed tore through nearby streets, collapsing walls and filling cellars. Several people drowned, unable to escape basements that filled with beer faster than they could climb out. Newspapers described the scene as both tragic and bizarre. Rescue workers struggling while bystanders tried to scoop up free beer with pots and pans. The neighborhood smelled of alcohol for weeks. Today, it almost sounds like a grim parody, a flood of beer sweeping through a city like something from a dark folktale, but it was very real, and for the victims, it was definitely no laughing matter.
And we begin with the tale of the cursed bread. In August 1951, a quiet village in southern France called Pont Saint-Esprit suddenly descended into total chaos. Overnight, hundreds of people started having these horrific hallucinations. People started saying they were seeing their houses shrinking, claiming to feel snakes eating their insides, or thought they were being chased by dragons. Over 300 villagers were affected by this. Dozens were hauled off to asylums and straitjackets, and 5 people ended up dead. For decades, the expert consensus was that this was a classic case of ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and can cause hallucinations similar to LSD if it's baked into bread. It seemed like an open and shut case of a baker using bad flour, but the mystery reopened years later when researchers started looking at these symptoms again. Ergot poisoning usually comes with physical signs, like gangrene, which didn't happen here. Then an investigative journalist named Hank Albarelli found declassified CIA documents. The documents mentioned the town by name in the context of Project MKUltra, the secret government program for mind control, which we've covered a number of times on the channel. So some researchers now believe the town was actually a test site for an aerosolized LSD experiment, or a contaminated food study run by the US military. Swear to God I'm not making that up. It doesn't mean that's actually the case, but it is one theory. In August of 1994, the small town of Oakville, Washington experienced a very strange weather event. Over the course of 3 weeks, instead of rain, people watched as these translucent gelatinous blobs fell from the sky. They were described as being roughly the size of half a grain of rice. Almost immediately after the blobs started falling, a large percentage of the town started to develop severe flu-like symptoms, extreme exhaustion, nausea, and respiratory issues that lasted for months. Even the animals were hit by this, with several outdoor pets falling ill and dying shortly after coming into contact with these strange blobs. A man named Sonny Barclift took a sample of the stuff to a doctor who eventually noticed something disturbing. The goo contained human white blood cells. Then the Washington State Department of Ecology did some testing. Their microbiologist, Mike McDowell, said that the blobs were teeming with two specific types of bacteria. One was a common strain found in the human digestive system. The other was a soil bacteria. For a while, the leading theory was that a military plane had discharged waste over the town, but the Federal Aviation Administration quickly pointed out that airplane waste is dyed blue. Plus, they don't just dump it mid-flight. To this day, we still don't know what these mysterious blobs were or where they came from. On a clear morning in February 1979, 5 friends boarded a Boston whaler called the Sarah Joe in Maui, Hawaii. They were heading out for a day of fishing, but then a massive unexpected storm rolled in. The boat and the 5 men vanished. The Coast Guard carried out a massive search, but they found absolutely nothing, not even debris. The case went cold for nearly a decade until 1988, when a marine biologist working for the National Marine Fisheries Service was doing a survey in the Marshall Islands. He found the wreckage of the Sarah Joe on this remote, uninhabited atoll. Next to the boat was a shallow grave marked by a crude wooden cross made of driftwood. Inside the grave were the jawbone and several remains of one of the missing men, Scott Moorman. So, mystery solved, right? Well, not exactly. The thing is, the Marshall Islands are thousands of miles upwind from where the boat disappeared. They should have been pushed in the opposite direction. Second, a team of biologists had done a thorough survey of that exact spot 6 years earlier, in 1982, and they testified that the boat and the grave were definitely not there at the time. If the boat arrived after 1982, it means it was floating in the open ocean for at least 3 years before landing. And what about the other 4 men? And who buried Moorman? To this day, nobody knows. In the desert of Durango, Mexico, there's a specific patch of land known as the Zona del Silencio, or the Silent Zone. In 1970, the US launched an Athena test missile from Green River, Utah. The missile was supposed to land in New Mexico, but it inexplicably veered hundreds of miles off course, heading straight for the Silent Zone. When the recovery teams arrived, they found that their radio equipment had stopped working. Communication between the recovery crews was nearly impossible because radio waves just wouldn't transmit. The area has been studied by a number of scientific groups who've confirmed that the zone is a kind of dead spot for radio, television, and shortwave signals. There are massive amounts of magnetite and uranium in the soil, which could cause the magnetic interference, but that doesn't fully explain why the interference is so localized. And to make it weirder, the zone seems to act like a giant magnet for space junk. It has one of the highest rates of meteorite strikes anywhere on Earth. Some people think the whole silent thing is a bit blown out of proportion, but plenty of pilots have reported their instruments going totally haywire or just flatlining the second they fly over the area. Even the animals there are built differently. There's a specific type of tortoise in the zone, and it has these strange physical mutations that you won't find in the exact same species living just a few miles away.
In 2014, a massive crater was discovered on the Yamal Peninsula in northern Russia in the Arctic tundra. It was deep, steep-walled, and dramatic, like something punched straight down into the ground. And the immediate question was simple. How does a hole like that appear out there, far from cities with no obvious construction explanation? Early theories flew everywhere, from meteor impacts to wild speculation. But researchers increasingly connected these craters to gas buildup under permafrost, basically pressure building until the ground bursts. Think of it like a sealed container that finally pops. There have been scientific studies analyzing how these gas emission craters could form, including pressure dynamics, permafrost conditions, and methane release. The exact mechanics of each crater can vary, and new research keeps refining the model. Here's a special kind of nightmare, a sound you cannot always record clearly, but you can feel, and it is messing with your sleep. Starting around 2011, residents in Windsor, Ontario reported an intermittent low-frequency noise, the Windsor hum. People described it as a droning vibration, sometimes strong enough to rattle things, and sometimes maddening because it would come and go with no predictable schedule. This was not just internet rumors. Investigations were conducted, and the work pointed toward an industrial source near Zug Island, a heavily industrialized area on the US side of the Detroit River. But even with that likely source area, the experience stayed mysterious for residents because the hum was intermittent and hard to point down. Weather, wind, industrial operations, and the way low-frequency sound travels can make it feel like it is everywhere and nowhere. This one is like a prank that got too perfect. In November 2020, a helicopter crew working with Utah wildlife officials spotted a metal monolith in a remote Red Rock area. They landed, walked up to it, and there it was, a tall, reflective, three-sided structure planted into the ground in the middle of nowhere. No sign, no plaque, no company name, no explanation. When officials publicly mentioned it, the internet did what the internet does. People treated it like an alien artifact, an art installation, a marketing stunt, or a weird social experiment. And then, not long after it became famous, it disappeared, reportedly removed by unknown individuals. This one starts like a classic meteor story, then takes a sharp turn into why is everyone getting ill? On September 15, 2007, a meteorite struck near a village in Peru. Witnesses described a loud explosion and a fireball, and the impact created a crater roughly 13 meters wide. So far, normal for a big meteorite fall. But after the impact, people who went near the crater reported becoming sick, with symptoms like nausea, headaches, and irritation. Reports described strange odors and even bubbling water in the crater. That sparked a wave of fear and speculation because meteorites are not usually associated with making crowds of onlookers feel ill. Scientists investigated, and one proposed explanation involved local groundwater contamination, including the possibility that vaporized water containing arsenic compounds contributed to symptoms when people inhaled it near the crater. The mystery is not that a meteorite hit. That part is confirmed. The mystery is the chain reaction of environmental factors that turned a space rock into a community health scare, and how fast the story went from cool crater to something is wrong here. If you're going to claim you saw something truly strange, an international airport is one of the worst places to do it because you would assume someone would immediately explain it. And yet, on November 7th, 2006, multiple United Airlines employees at Chicago O'Hare International Airport reported seeing a metallic, disc-shaped object hovering near gate C-17. The reports described it as silent, close enough to be clearly seen, and then it shot upward through the cloud layer, leaving what some witnesses described as a hole in the clouds. No confirmed radar track was publicly tied to it. The FAA did not produce a public investigation that resolved it as a specific object, but the reason it remains one of the most famous modern airport sightings is the setting and the number of employee witnesses. This was not one person in the middle of nowhere. It was a cluster of workers at a major hub in broad daylight conditions, all describing something that sounded physical and close. Even if you lean skeptical at all, it is still a mystery event in the sense that an identifiable, official, widely accepted, this is exactly what it was explanation has never fully landed.
In 1859, a war between the US and Britain almost broke out, all thanks to a pig. It started on San Juan Island, a little strip of land between what's now Washington State and Canada. The US and Britain both thought they owned it because the treaty that set their border was vague about which waterway the boundary followed. So both sides moved in. British settlers working for Hudson's Bay Company and a handful of American farmers trying to claim land. For a while, they awkwardly coexisted, but then one American farmer, Lyman Cutler, found a pig rooting through his potato garden and fired at it. That pig belonged to a British man named Charles Griffin. Griffin demanded $100 in compensation. Cutler offered 10. Well, this little dispute escalated into a full-on military standoff. The Americans sent troops led by Captain George Pickett, who'd later fight at Gettysburg, while the British sent warships with over 2,000 men on board. And for weeks, they just stared at each other, armed to the teeth. Eventually, though, cooler heads prevailed and both governments agreed to share the island until it was officially settled years later. In the end, nobody died, no shots were fired, and the only casualty of what was later referred to as the Pig War was the pig. In the middle of the Cold War, the world almost ended because of a computer glitch. Luckily though, one guy kept his cool. On September 26th of 1983, a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov was working the night shift at a secret bunker near Moscow. His job was to monitor the early warning satellites that were supposed to detect incoming US nuclear missiles. Just past midnight, alarms went off. The system was screaming that an American missile had been launched, and then 4 more right after it. At the time, tensions between the US and the Soviet Union were at their absolute worst. Reagan was calling the USSR the evil empire, the Soviets had just shot down a Korean passenger plane, and both sides were running drills that looked a lot like real attacks. Soviet leadership was very on edge, convinced a first strike was coming any day. The military's official response plan was launch on warning, meaning the second they detected an attack, they'd fire back immediately. But Petrov didn't do that. He didn't think the warning made any sense. A real US strike would involve hundreds of missiles, not 5. He decided to hold off, refusing to report it up the chain until radar confirmation came through, which never did. Turned out sunlight reflecting off clouds had tricked the satellites. If he'd followed protocol, the Soviets might have launched their own nukes in response, and the world would be looking a hell of a lot different right now. In the 1600s Ottoman Empire, drinking coffee could literally get you killed. The ruler at the time, Sultan Murad IV, decided coffee was a political threat. Coffee houses in Istanbul had exploded in popularity, and just like today, these were places where people would sit around for hours talking about business, religion, whatever was bothering them about politics. Murad didn't like that people were gathering like this, sharing what he viewed as possibly dangerous ideas. He already had a reputation for being ruthless. I mean, this was a guy known for executing people over breaking curfew, so when he decided coffee was dangerous, anyone caught drinking it was gonna have problems, and that they would be beheaded on the spot. Yes, some stories even say he'd walk through Istanbul in disguise, sword in hand, personally hunting down coffee drinkers. That is insane. But like any corrupt politician, the hypocrisy was rampant. Murad himself drank coffee in private. Later rulers were a lot more chill about things. First offense, you'd just get a beating. Second offense, well, then you'd be sewn into a leather bag and tossed into the sea. By the 18th century, these bans fizzled out, fortunately, but for a while there, drinking a cup of coffee in Istanbul could literally cost you your life. You would not ever expect there to be any kind of ban on kissing in France, of all places, but back in 1910, they officially banned couples from kissing on train platforms. This was still the early days of train travel when stations were chaotic and too many trains were being delayed because people just wouldn't stop making out, doing these long, drawn-out goodbyes. The law was introduced at stations across France after a few incidents where trains left late because conductors couldn't get couples to stop blocking the doors or tracks. So the government decided to put up signs prohibiting people from kissing. The law technically stayed in place for decades afterwards, but it was rarely enforced. Do you know why the London sewer system is what it is today? It's because back in the Victorian era, the capital of the British Empire became uninhabitable from the stench of its own waste. The summer of 1858 was not fondly remembered by Londoners. It was the summer of what became known as the Great Stink. That year, the River Thames basically turned into a giant open sewer. For years, the city had been dumping human waste, animal remains, and industrial garbage straight into the river. Normally, the flow of water carried most of it away, but that summer was unusually hot for London. Temperatures hit 32 degrees Celsius or over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, so everything just started to rot. The smell was unbearable. Parliament, which sat right next to the Thames, had to soak their curtains in chloride of lime just to cover up the odor. One MP wrote that the, quote, air was so bad it was not only offensive to smell, but dangerous to health. And it was deadly. The same contaminated water had already caused multiple cholera outbreaks, killing tens of thousands of people. The smell finally forced the government to act. A civil engineer named Joseph Bazalgette was brought in to design a massive new sewer system, something London had resisted funding for years. On September 22, 1979, an American Vela satellite specifically designed to monitor secret nuclear tests detected this double flash of light in the remote Indian Ocean, near the Prince Edward Islands. In nuclear physics, a double flash is the telltale sign of nuclear detonation. The first flash is the initial blast, the second is the fireball expanding. So naturally, the US government went into full crisis mode, assuming someone had just set off a nuke in the middle of nowhere. But when they sent surveillance planes to the area to collect air samples, they found absolutely zero radioactive fallout. A White House panel of scientists eventually said that the satellite had probably just been hit by what's called a zoo event, which is just a way of saying that a tiny meteoroid might have struck the sensor at just the right angle to trick it. But physicists weren't really buying that. They argued that the chances of a random meteor perfectly mimicking the exact light signature of a nuclear blast was basically zero. To make things even weirder, underwater sensors picked up a massive sound wave at the exact same time, which is exactly what you'd expect from an ocean explosion. To this day, the case is unresolved. This one is super gross. In March 1876, a woman named Mrs. Crouch was sitting on her porch in Bath County, Kentucky, when chunks of fresh red meat began falling from the clear blue sky. And it wasn't just a few scraps, it fell like rain all over town. Sounds like a tall tale, but this is a well-documented case. It was even covered by the New York Times and Scientific American. And a few people, and I'm not sure whether to call them brave souls or just idiots, and yes, they actually did this, they decided to test the meat, reporting that it tasted like mutton or venison, but they couldn't quite place the animal. Some independent researchers did a microscopic analysis and found that the meat contained bits of lung, muscle, and cartilage. So where did it all come from? Well, first there's the vulture theory. The idea is that a large flock of vultures flying overhead had recently gorged themselves on a dead cow or a horse, and when they took flight, they collectively vomited to lighten their load. This is a thing, apparently, but many people who were there insisted the meat fell from a height and that there was a strange snapping sound. Plus, there were no reports of any massive flocks of birds in the area that day. Since we can't exactly re-examine the 150-year-old meat, this remains one of the most bizarre weather events in history. This one sounds like a total urban legend, but it is rooted in some very strange reports from air traffic controllers in Caracas, Venezuela. In 1992, a plane suddenly appeared on radar out of nowhere. The pilot contacted the tower, sounding panicked, and told them he was Flight 914, scheduled to land in Miami on July 2nd, 1955. The controllers were stunned. Apparently, they were looking at a plane that was 37 years late. The pilot managed to land the plane. The ground crew could see the faces of the passengers pressed against the windows. They looked terrified. Before the authorities could get to the aircraft, though, the pilot screamed into the radio, "Don't come near us. We're leaving now." He taxied the plane back to the runway and took off before anyone could stop him. No one has ever found a record of where that plane went after it took off from Caracas, and while many people claim the story was a hoax from a tabloid, no one's been able to explain the specific air traffic logs that recorded this unidentified vintage aircraft entering restricted airspace that day. In July 1952, for 2 weekends in a row, the most restricted airspace in the world was basically invaded, and the US government had zero answers. Air traffic controllers at Washington National Airport started seeing 7 blips on their radar. The objects were moving at about 130 miles per hour, but would suddenly accelerate to over 7,000 miles per hour. For context, the fastest jets at the time could barely hit 600 miles per hour. The Air Force sent out some jets to see what was going on, but as soon as the jets got there, the blips vanished from the radar. As soon as they headed back to base to refuel, the blips popped right back up in the exact same spots. This happened multiple times. It was like whatever was up there was actually monitoring the pilot's radio chatter. The explanation at the time was a temperature inversion, basically saying that the radar was bouncing off a layer of warm air and creating mirages, but the radar operators who had years of experience called BS on that. pointing out that a temperature inversion looks like a steady, ghostly blur on a screen, not distinct objects performing high-speed maneuvers over the White House. In January 1921, a massive schooner called the Carroll A. Deering was found run aground off the coast of North Carolina. When the Coast Guard was finally able to get on board, they found that the galley was full of food, being prepped for the next meal, but not a single soul was on the ship. The lifeboats were gone, and so were the ship's logs and navigation equipment, but all the crew's personal belongings were sitting in their cabins. There were no signs of a fight, and the ship was in perfectly good condition. The government launched a massive investigation involving the FBI and the Treasury Department. They looked into every theory, from pirates to mutiny. During the heat of the investigation, a man named Christopher Columbus Gray claimed that he found a message in a bottle from the crew. The note said the ship had been captured by a mysterious oil-burning vessel, and that the crew was being held prisoner. So, the FBI started investigating, and unfortunately, they'd been completely thrown off course. Turned out that note was a total fake. Gray had written it himself and found it because he was desperate for a job at the local lighthouse and thought he'd look like a hero when he found a major lead in a national mystery. I don't think he ended up getting the job. Once the note was debunked, the FBI was back at square one. If it was a mutiny, why was there no struggle? If they hit bad weather and used the lifeboats, why didn't a single piece of debris or a single body ever wash up on the coast? The investigation was officially closed in 1922 without a single person being able to explain what happened to those 11 men.